The Ukrainian aimed his rifle at the Russian who was hiding in the trench. He fired to keep the enemy pinned down and then threw a grenade. In another clash, the Russians tried to escape from the drones by running toward another shelter. There were 3 soldiers running, unaware that the Ukrainian was positioned in one of the houses. In the midst of so many battles, something changed on the front line, something that triggered panic messages among the Russians. But what was actually happening at the Zaporizhia front? The terror messages in some Russian groups sounded strange when referring to Zaporizhia, especially in the Uriapol region. Putin had mentioned the place, and Moscow's troops even celebrated what would be one of their great achievements in the area. Suddenly, however, the Russian propagandist channels were flooded with reports of chaos, pain, and gnashing of teeth. The situation seemed contradictory since it was the Russians themselves who were relentlessly bombing Uriapol. For months, smoke has become the indelible mark left by the blasts among the trees and small houses in the region. The explosions were non-stop, occurring in succession even before the soot from previous attacks had dispersed in the sky. The Ukrainians who survived this offensive knew that the worst was yet to come. They resisted bravely, despite the series of problems that made the situation worse. The Russian march toward Uriapol began many months earlier. Although the Zaporizhia front had lost its prominence since the Ukrainian counteroffensive of 2023, the region was still the scene of intense battles. The fall of Volodar in the south of Donetsk Oblast paved the way for a swift advance by Moscow's troops. This progression allowed Russia to apply a fundamental strategy to dominate pockets of resistance, the pincer movement aiming to encircle cities and choke off supply routes. The 2nd Battalion of the 102nd Territorial Defense Brigade has suffered under the constant pounding of Russian artillery since June 2025. No fortification seemed capable of withstanding such a heavy barrage of impacts. The survivors, taking refuge in their hideouts, were already anticipating the enemy's next move. As soon as the smoke cleared and the prayers of thanks ended, the omnipresent buzzing of drones appeared, the fate of the modern soldier. Many hid, hoping the machines wouldn't penetrate the shelters. One soldier tried to repel the threat with shots from his Avtomat Kalashnikova rifle. The drone, even with the wavering signal, kept its course fixed on the silhouette of the Ukrainian and exploded against the shelter. The soldier disappeared. Under the smoke, heavy drones invaded the openings in the roofs, detonating before even touching the ground. The kinetic energy of the explosion shattered the residences, knocking down walls and hurling debris through the air. As the Russians cleared fields and villages on the way to Uriapol, their drone pilots advanced. The operating bases began using fiber-optic-controlled drones to nullify electronic interference, setting up deadly ambushes against vehicles. It became clear that, in that war, keeping supply lines and troop rotations flowing was just as vital as destroying armored vehicles. Driven by this effort, small groups of Russian infantry began to infiltrate the villages after crossing the vastness of the fields, where many were left behind along the way. These soldiers were transported by motorcycles or civilian vehicles to about 20 kilometers from the target, then proceeded on foot in small groups until they reached villages near Uriapol. Like Zeleny and Rai, they stormed the houses, firing frantically, taking control of the rooms before even confirming the presence of enemies. The tactic was clear: shoot first, ask questions later. The risk taken during the crossing was too high to allow any surprises from above. Russian drone pilots provided protection with real-time reconnaissance, neutralizing the heavy Ukrainian Baba-Yaga drones. These advances, combined with powerful bombardments, displaced the Ukrainian forces from some of their original positions. Russian flags were raised, celebrating the captures and informing the command that another village had been taken. However, there was something beyond the maps and territorial gains, something that was not being officially reported, but that was fueling a growing panic. The Ukrainians worked hard to contain the enemy's advance. The Air Force prepared attacks with Mikoyan Gurevich fighters right after the drones identified the targets. By this time, Russian detachments were increasing their numbers in Zeleny High, but these groups were hit by hundreds of kilograms of explosives. In their hideouts being decimated, Ukrainian drones hunted down the survivors. Those flying pests had become Ukraine's main line of defense. The soldiers were too exhausted to fight off Russian incursions between their positions, and often, even with nearby defense groups, the most effective option was to send in Russian and Ukrainian drones. Often, they didn't even see or fight each other directly, even though they were less than 500 meters apart. These were unusual positions without a well-defined front line, where drones flew in to kill while the soldiers just waited. The Russian fighters actually managed to advance considerably in the region, benefiting from serious structural problems in the Ukrainian armed forces at the end of 2025. A soldier from the 2nd Battalion of the 102nd and Territorial Defense Brigade reported that. Since June, the unit had been repelling constant Russian attacks near Ulyaipol, suffering severe losses of personnel and equipment. Russian drones watched the skies while bombers massacred them. In a single day, Moscow's forces launched as many as 106 guided air bombs against the villages in that sector. According to the soldier, the unit hardly received any reinforcements, and the soldiers remained in their positions for months without any problems. Ground logistics in that area were almost non-existent, and supplies were delivered by drones. A former soldier from the Psychological Support Department of the 102nd Brigade stated that after the unit was transferred to the Southern Operational Command, the brigade commander and all his deputies were replaced, resulting in the demoralization of the troops. The Russians advanced brutally, their snipers moving cautiously through the villages, finding gaps opened by the small assault groups. These snipers would walk until they found ideal shelters to position their rifles, patiently waiting for their prey. Before opening fire, Moscow's war machines put on a demolition show in the villages heading toward Ulyaipol. Howitzers shattered houses and smoke took over homes where families once dined. Roofs raised with the sweat of workers were destroyed in a matter of seconds. Under pressure, the Ukrainians had to retreat. The Russians took the opportunity to force those who were surrounded to surrender, but at a certain point they decided not to take prisoners, executing them right there on the ground. By this time, winter had already set in, and the weather was relentless for both sides. The Ukrainian command responded by sending the 125th Assault Regiment to retaliate against the Russian forces. Experienced in high-intensity combat, they identified enemy movements and alerted the defenders, who began firing from the windows. A corpse lay stretched out on the ground while others tried to retreat. A drone approached, detonating a neighboring house, but 3 soldiers still managed to escape. That was when the Baba-Yaga got theirs. Each of these heavy drones carried multiple explosives to hunt down the Russians. The detonations rained down from the clouds onto men who already considered themselves victors. Occasionally, a kamikaze drone would appear to take the life of yet another invader. During that period, the 2nd Battalion was transferred to the 125th Brigade, sent along with other groups to stabilize the front. The attempt failed, resulting in a new transfer, while the 125th Regiment continued the offensive with its drones. The name of the witches from Slavic folklore was not chosen by chance. Baba Yaga was the deformed old woman who flew around hunting and devouring children, a terrifying force of nature. In the skies of Uliaipol, the mechanical witch flew overhead to feed on the lives of Russians. The horrifying result of her raids led 2 of those soldiers to turn their weapons on themselves, saying goodbye to the war on their own terms. Troops from Ukraine's 33rd Assault Regiment attacked isolated points under Russian control, located within regions where Ukrainian soldiers still remained. Without support and surrounded, the Russians became easy targets for drone-coordinated attacks. A Ukrainian soldier threw a grenade into the enemy shelter. The explosion heated up the freezing hole, where the invaders huddled, wounded, and pinned down by gunfire from outside could do little. A shot even hit near the Ukrainian. But the soldier from Kyiv kept the advantage, throwing a second grenade. As soon as a comrade appeared to support him, the explosives became the catalyst for the mission, and confidence allowed the final approach. The explosions shook the Russians, while the well-lubricated triggers activated the death mechanisms of the rifles. The ammunition hit the ground inside the shelter, seeking the invaders' blood. Realizing the lack of reaction, the Ukrainians stormed the place, shooting, ending the lives of Moscow's envoys. The Russian soldiers fell on the way to Uliaipol, and gradually panic began to set in for an absurd reason: the negligence of corrupt commanders. At the end of 2025, Putin received the news that Uliaipol and the surrounding regions had been taken. It was the kind of victorious report the Russian president expected to receive. He smiled, gave a speech, and celebrated. Everyone around him enjoyed the taste of those achievements. He learned that his snipers were already infiltrating the villages, taking down Ukrainians in agonizing deaths, while batteries of multiple rocket launchers unleashed new waves of fire on the defensive positions. With each impact of a heavy shell, the intangible human cost for the defenders grew worse. Putin was informed about the advance, but not about the isolation of his troops. Many times, Russian soldiers simply occupied positions and fought to survive, expanding the gray zone, that undefined vacuum between the lines of fire. However, Ukrainian drones dominated theirs, eliminating any attempt at regrouping. The charges dropped by Baba Yaga drones decimated the ranks that tried to move under the cover of night. Occasionally, survivors reached a trench only to be met by fighters, like a Colombian soldier who was defending the sector. The Russian bodies were left lying in front of the shelters, where grenades were thrown. For a moment, the explosions warmed the whole. Freezing in the winter, the heat also came from Ukrainian artillery. Rocket launchers stationed near Uliaipol increased the pressure on the Russians scattered in the gray zone. Give up, Ukrainian soldiers, don't give up. A Russian soldier, exhausted from the long marches and constantly fleeing from drones, slipped in the snow. He tried to seek refuge in a house with his rifle lowered, but was met with lead. As he tried to escape, he collapsed on the ice. His companions, who were right behind him, met the same fate. A single survivor crawled through the cold snow, feeling blood soak his clothes until the Ukrainian left the safety of his shelter. To execute, they executed the enemy. There seemed to be a total disconnect in the Russian command. Soldiers tried to move through areas their superiors claimed were under control, only to be spotted by drones and forced to seek new cover under fire. The Russians died in and around the villages. Small Ukrainian counterattacks gradually cleared more areas in the gray zone, leading to reports of panic about the recapture of territory. Russian propagandists, in desperation, blamed the Starlink system outage, because admitting the reality of the facts would mean contradicting their own celebrations of victory. These propagandists displayed maps of Ukrainian advances, hurling insults, looking for someone to blame so they wouldn't have to talk about their own lies. Their comments were as shallow as those of armchair generals, who still saw the conflict through static trench lines like those of World War I. More clear-headed Russian analysts, however, explained clearly the nature of the Ukrainian success at that specific moment in the war. It was precisely at this point that the analysis from the Channel 2 Majors, a Russian military channel, emerged. On Telegram, with more than 1.2 million subscribers known for technical assessments, even though aligned with Moscow. The Russian victories reported in that sector were just on paper. They described the battlefield as a layered cake, with Russian and Ukrainian positions interspersed without a continuous or defined front line. In the gray area, the channel highlighted a simple concept for the layman. The entry of assault groups into a village does not mean it has been captured. Real control only exists when the combat zone advances dozens of kilometers beyond the village, allowing for the creation of logistics and solid defenses. In the current scenario, dominated by drones and small infiltration groups, the temporary presence of soldiers is often mistaken for full territorial control. And many Russian commanders take advantage of this to create illusory victories, applauded by superiors and by supporters on the internet. By applying this logic, reality moves away from the panic narrative. Small Russian groups advanced through the gray zone, raised flags as if they were complete victories, and reported the liberation of the area. However, the ground remained unstable when Ukrainian counterattacks removed these isolated groups. The propagandists interpreted this as a retaking of territory or a collapse caused by the loss of Starlink. In practice, it was just the removal of a temporary presence, not a loss of consolidated Russian positions. The propagandists' mistake was to confuse presence with control. If the initial advances were inflated, as 2 Majors himself admitted, the subsequent losses were also exaggerated. The shock did not come from a drastic military change, but from the fact that commanders lied at the beginning when they lost territory they never actually controlled. In fact, they created the illusion of a great Ukrainian victory. No. From the Russian, more technical perspective, there was no evidence that Ukraine had retaken consolidated positions between January and early February 2026. What happened was an intense dispute in the gray zone. The panic did not reflect a turning point in the war, but rather the fragility of a narrative that treated temporary gains as definitive achievements. However, new changes were on the way, and an analysis of the influence of Starlink and the upcoming Ukrainian counterattacks would be fundamental. In the following days, the Ukrainians took advantage of this, creating even more intense fighting on that little discussed front.